We have been going through the Gospel of Matthew. And if you remember, according to some very, very smart and intelligent people, scholars, etc., there are about five distinct discourses or topics in which Jesus speaks authoritatively on in this particular Gospel of Matthew. Now the first being the Sermon on the Mount. Remember that one? We spent a lot of time on that one through our book study. And basically it was Jesus teaching on a new way, a new kingdom unlike any other kingdom the world has seen, bent on justice and life abundant rather than oppression. Now the second conversation was on missions, how Jesus trusted his disciples to multiply his efforts and go out and do what he did. And now we find ourselves in the third discourse or conversation in which Jesus speaks very authoritatively on. And this one is on parables. Parables. Now, if you don't know what a parable is, or if you haven't heard what a parable is a simple story used to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson. Now, last week, Ronnie mentioned how Jesus was attempting to reach as many people as he could through different methods or through different vehicles. Now, the first being that of a sermon, Then, through the idea of mission, and how through this idea of parables requires us to think a little bit, that's a little bit deeper than just what's on the surface. Now, if you think about those things, one being a sermon, one being mission, or being more experiential, and this idea of parables, which really makes you think on a different level, there are three really different ways in which Jesus is teaching about this idea of the kingdom. Now, I know a lot of people, one being my wife Erin per se, she really doesn't, her method of teaching is a lot more not so much sermon oriented. That's not the way she really learns. So she learns through different means, through prayer, through more experiential things like missions kind of thing. So it's really interesting to see how Jesus is trying to connect with any and all that would want to know more information about his kingdom, or this new kingdom he is trying to inaugurate into the world. So maybe we could all kind of think about the ways in which we learn too. Maybe it is through maybe a message or a sermon, or through something a little bit more experiential, or just maybe some more philosophical things that kind of make you think, more like a parable. So these are the three ways so far in which Jesus is trying to reach people, which I think is fascinating, which is really fascinating that Jesus would attempt to reach as many people as he could through different avenues. So on this idea of parables, we see Jesus spending a lot of time speaking about what the kingdom of God is like now. Now Matt, a few weeks ago, opened up this discourse talking about the parable of the sower, and the 4 C's. And Ronnie spoke last week about the parable of the weeds and the wheat last week. And now today we're going to take a closer look at just 3 verses, all of 3 verses. We're going to take a closer look at the ever so popular parable, that is the parable of the mustard seed, and the parable of the yeast in Matthew 13. But before we look at this passage, I want us to kind of imagine something. Imagine, that's kind of the key word here. Now imagine we met someone whom asked you, how would you describe the wind? Maybe this person could be a space alien from a different planet who's never experienced Earth before. But if someone were to ask you to describe the wind, what would you say? How would you describe it, right? And you could probably think about this during this talk as well, because I'd imagine some of us are thinking, wind is, it's always moving air. It's like moving air kind of thing. You can't really see it, but it's there kind of thing. It could be gentle. It could be gentle like maybe a feather's touch, right? If you've been in a gentle breeze before. Or, it could be violent or harsh. And, I want to bring light to what, there was a hurricane in Florida this past week that I read reports, and it was just really, really catastrophic and dangerous. And we want to think about and pray for those people too down there who are affected. The winds got up to maybe 150 miles per hour, which is just devastating. I can't even think about how much force that could be. So in an instance like that, yeah, wind could be really violent or harsh, kind of like being pushed over with a lot of force, or being hit by a car, or it's like being hit by a train almost, that kind of in that kind of environment. So when we take a step back from all that, when describing abstract concepts like the wind, if you think about it, yeah, we often employ metaphors, right? Metaphors are similes to describe it. Now, these literary devices are effective ways for giving what? It gives us color, life, and meaning to concepts that would otherwise be difficult to understand or even describe. So saying like the wind is like this, the wind is like, well, it's like it's like a feather's touch when a feather touches your skin, or it's like violent and harsh, like being literally pushed over onto the ground kind of thing. So, hence parables, Jesus is using these literary devices to give color, life, and meaning to the concept, in this case, the kingdom of heaven, being the kingdom of heaven, in words and terms and contexts that the common folk in the time that Jesus was alive in the first century could understand, could grasp, could really, really wrap their heads around. So with that being said, now, onto our scripture this morning. It comes from Matthew 13, 31 through 33. Matthew 13, 31 through 33. So all of 3 verses. And if you're thinking, yeah, we've read the parable of mustard seed many times, so let's read it again and hopefully look for some new truth today. So verse 31 says this: He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Now, on to verse 33, which is the parable of the yeast. He then told another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Okay, I want to read one more time. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with. Now the original, I have a footnote on my Bible. Now the original word for that mixed in with part is, or hid in. So it could read like this too. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Now, back to the wind idea really quickly. The tools or metaphors are only effective if the person who hears them understands the references being used. Now, if I never, felt the touch of a feather on my skin, I kind of not know what a gentle breeze feels like, right? You would have no reference to it. So, while the descriptions get us closer to the meaning, the actual meaning, it is not the same as experiencing it. So specifically, it is the difference between knowing about something and actually knowing something. See the difference there? Knowing about something and actually knowing something. So in this text, Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to several concepts in order to enhance the crowd's understanding of his teaching, which is why his descriptions were real day living for, these people that were living in Jesus' time. Something, again, that they can all grasp and understand. So looking more broadly at this particular chapter in Matthew 13, Jesus ends this chapter by creating a more descriptive explanation of the kingdom of heaven, right? And he explains it in 5 very brief parables, very brief, as we talked about 2 of them, and they were all 3 verses. After 2 detailed parables about the sower and the seeds and the weeds, to which, again, Matt and Ronnie spoke on, respectively, the past few weeks. It's almost as if someone said to Jesus, well, can you tell us more about this kingdom of heaven? Like, how would you describe it? Because I get the sower and the seeds and the weeds. Any other explanations for it? So Jesus concludes his message to the crowd by saying that the kingdom is like a mustard seed. It's like yeast. It's like hidden treasure, a merchant who searches for and finds fine pearls, and finally a net, to which the latter parables we'll get to another time in these next few weeks. Now, each of these short descriptions expands, again, it's meant to expand our understanding of God's kingdom. Now, a little bit about mustard seeds. The mustard seed, the smallest of all seeds, the mustard seed grows into a tree, or becomes a shrub, and then comes a tree. When Jesus emphasizes the size of the seed, it refers mainly to the very modest beginning of the kingdom of heaven being realized on earth. Jesus marks the commencement of this era. He may be signifying to the crowd that from these very modest beginnings, from these really small beginnings, great things will happen, right? Great things will happen because out of the smallest of seeds, it turns into a shrub and then into a tree, right? So the next mention of the mustard seed in Matthew's gospel comes later in verse 17, a few chapters down the line, where Jesus tells his disciples that the faith of a mustard seed can what? Faith the size of a mustard seed can actually move mountains. Isn't that interesting? So again, what is seemingly invisible, or very, very small, can have an overwhelming impact. Like the seeds mentioned in the previous parables, like in the parable of the sower, the mustard seed too will produce a yield. So again, this parable of the mustard seed calls to mind the parable of the sower, but rather than focus on the soil or the seed, it focuses on the tree or the shrub that emerges, sturdy enough to house the nest of birds. So it doesn't just grow into something really big and grand and good, pleasing to the eye. It actually has a function, right? It actually has a function. It houses birds and their nests. Now, if we look into Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, if you go back a few chapters in the Gospel of Matthew, birds also receive God's care. Remember that in Matthew 6. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them, right? So again, it's interesting how all these thoughts are kind of connected from Jesus. He's bringing something in that he talked about, and he's referencing it again in a parable, more or less. Now, stories of trees in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, often have to do with power and rule. So the prophets, a lot of the books in the Bible, there's a genre of prophetic words, or the prophets. The prophets in the Old Testament use or tended to use tree images to announce God's power and rule over the imperial powers, or hence the empires of the time, of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. Now, this mustard seed then depicts God's empire that both resists and mimics all other empires to rule over all in a way that promises not oppression, because again, this is what empires and imperial forces did. They oppressed people, more or less. They invaded their home territories. They occupied it, and more or less they said, if you don't stand in line, if you don't follow our rules, you're gonna die. More or less, yeah, you're gonna die. So basically, they were the boss. They oppressed it on these other people. But God's empire would rule in a different way. God's empire would rule in a very different way. With what? With justice, with life abundant. It's a little different, right? It's a little different than versus oppression. Now, the nesting birds point to this idea, this vision, or the same vision. The birds of the heaven symbolize the people, the nations who have lived under oppression. And there's various passages about this in the books of Ezekiel and Daniel. So in this mustard seed, they find welcome and hospitality that supports life rather than destroys it. Now, a little bit about yeast. Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to yeast. Now, I've never made bread before, but it takes yeast to blow the bread up into something that is really delicious and really good. So when yeast is added to flour, it causes the flour to rise. And I say that because I had this really good buddy of mine who actually made homemade really different kinds of bread, and they were just so good and so delicious. And he just told me, he's like, yeah, just get me flour and I'll make it for you. I know it's really, really good. In any case, yeast is a key ingredient for making bread, because without it, what happens? Bread cannot be fluffy and light. So in other words, the kingdom of heaven, which Jesus is trying to describe here, is transformative and uplifting. That without God's reign, life would be what? It would be flat. It would be dull. It wouldn't be uplifting in a lot of ways. So using that kind of language as well, it is the presence of God's kingdom that empowers God's people to quite literally rise above life's circumstances, right? And I want to say it one more time because I feel like that's important. It is the presence of God's kingdom that empowers God's people to quite literally rise above life's circumstances. Because unfortunately, in the Gospel of Matthew 2, he talks about how it rains on not just the wicked, but also the righteous, right? Life circumstances comes at us whether or not we're good or evil or trying to be good or trying to be bad kind of thing. Life circumstances just happen. Life just happens. So this empowers all of us, more or less, that God's people could quite literally rise above life circumstances, even though they still happen to us. So the tangibleness of the kingdom of heaven is revealed where this parable of the woman and the yeast touches on images found elsewhere in the gospel as well. So the parable of the yeast builds on the theme of God's care by anticipating the feeding of the multitudes. Remember that story where Jesus feeds 10,000 people and 5,000 people? Now, this story is told, a few times in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, notably, Matthew adds that it was not just the men who were fed in these, massive feedings of the multitude, but also women and children. And the women and the children, those were the ones that were often most vulnerable when food is scarce. Because again, women and children were not on the same playing field, or they didn't have the same status as men. Now, it is an interesting choice by Jesus to specifically mention that it's a woman that took a little yeast and mixes it with flour to leaven the whole batch. Because again, women were not on the same playing field as men in this time status-wise. So it's kind of a lot that Jesus is including women in on his teaching in the kingdom of heaven, as if to saying, we're all included. Everyone here is included in this. Now, relative to the larger amount of flour, there are 3 measures of flour, suggesting the final, dare I say, heavenly vision, heavenly vision of abundant food. The yeast is only a very, very small quantity. It's tiny. It's really small. Yet, to where Jesus says that, the yeast is more or less hidden in the flour. Like the woman hides the yeast in the flour more or less. But it's that much yeast, that smaller presence that has big, grand effects. The woman literally, again, hides the leaven in the flour, that which seems to be invisible in the fact, mysteriously and inevitably performing its leavening work. So the status quo does not remain unchanged. By means of a time-consuming process, all of flour was leavened by that much yeast, by a really small amount of yeast. So the passive voice indicates God's transformative work in the world. Now, like again, Ronnie mentioned last week, the transformative work going on right now in the world is happening. It's happening. And guess what? Each and every one of us are a part of it. We're all part of it, whether you like it or not. Now, if you're thinking like me, well, how do you know if you're a part of it? Or I don't really feel a part of it. I just don't feel it. And maybe I'm not connected to God enough, or maybe I'm not reading the Bible enough, or maybe I'm not doing this or that enough. I don't really feel a part of it. I have an answer for that. I do have an answer for that, and I hope it helps. And it comes from a woman named Holly Heron, whom is a professor of New Testament and a published author. And she says this: while the piling up of parable after parable in this passage can make it a challenge to find a focus, the structure of the passage reveals thematic development. The 2 parables in Matthew 13, 31 to 33, the parable of the mustard seed and the woman and the leaven, both draw attention to remarkable growth arising from insignificant beginnings. Okay? They both draw attention to remarkable growth arising from very insignificant beginnings. Because if you think about it, of interest are the diverse socioeconomic settings represented in the parables. Now, a sower of a seed, going a few weeks ago, the sower of a seed was basically a farmer, right? A woman baking bread, right? and we'll get into these later, but a fortune seeker, a merchant, a commercial fisherman, right? What do these people have in common? These reflect types easily recognized in the world that Jesus walked on, right? In the first century. And guess what? Even today, right? Too. Even today, each individual going about their work. If you think about it on a, take it a step, further, the ordinariness, or the very ordinary tasks, right? Everyday life. If you think about what you do on the day-to-day, the ordinariness of the task invites us to see signs of the kingdom of heaven in our day-to-day lives, in our moment-to-moment lives, to recognize that it is emerging, that this kingdom is emerging in our very midst, right? The sower of a seed, being a farmer or a commercial fisherman, right? A woman who bakes bread, makes food, right? Making dinner, kind of thing. These things become invitations to cultivate the practice of seeing God's work in our ordinary lives. So it may seem like for a lot of us, it's like, I don't really feel like I'm really a part of God's kingdom right now, or I don't feel like I'm doing anything, positive, for the Lord, or for maybe our church, or for, and take a step back, according to Jesus, maybe you are, and you just don't know it. And these parables are a way for us to think about it in a way where it captures our imagination to what the kingdom of heaven is like. Our offerings to God, sometimes it's small. And I recall being in a Bible study where, it was one of those times where, nothing really was kind of popping or clicking. It was just kind of a random conversation. And I recall the person at the end prayed, and I'll never forget this prayer, because he was like, Lord, I know today we didn't have a whole lot to offer to you, Lord, but I pray that you would use it, right? And maybe some of us have felt that in our lives, that, there are times or occurrences in life where we just didn't have a lot to offer to God based on what we were going through, or maybe it was a hard time or whatnot. Again, offerings to God, sometimes it's small and not that much to offer to Him, but guess what? God could use what we offer and turn it into something magnificent. No matter how small or invisible it may seem, God could use that. We just have to be willing. Like, after one of those days that didn't go our way, it's like, you should pray, right? Or you should ask God for help, but it's like, I don't even know where to start. Like, I feel like so dug in deep or in that rabbit hole, like I don't know where to start. Like, I can't even think to get out of where I'm at right now, right? Felt that way, you're definitely not alone. And I believe that's okay. That's okay. That honesty and transparency with our Creator, our Creator, or the Creator of all things, is what He wants. It's what He yearns for, right? Because again, I know I harped on this a lot in the past several months, He wants our hearts. God wants our hearts. Because why? Out of our hearts, our actions follow. So I encourage you, and I leave you, and we're going to conclude with this idea that the mustard seed's small. The yeast in the bread may be small and invisible, but it can do magnificent things. So I pray that whatever that we offer to God isn't insignificant. And I pray that if you're going through something hard, or if life isn't really going your way at this point, know that God is still there, and that what little we have to offer maybe to Him could be used in a magnificent way. So I really implore you to not lose hope in this time, but but to see life as a blessing, right? As to see life as rising above these circumstances that are before us, because this is what the Lord calls us to do. Because again, out of our heart, our actions follow. So I pray that as we kind of chew on this, and as we wrestle with this and struggle with this throughout the week, I pray that God would meet us and find us and give us hope in this time. So with all this being said, may grace and peace be with you all.